Friends of Oak Hills, this is Pastor Dale with our weekly video Touchpoint. Today is Thursday, July 24, 2025. This article is titled A Model Marriage? Genesis 2:24 provides God's blueprint for marriage, which reads, "Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." Jesus quotes this verse in Matthew 19, verse 5, as he is answering the Pharisees' question about divorce. Paul quotes this verse from Genesis in Ephesians 5:31 as he describes God's design and roles for marriage. In a nutshell, God's blueprint for marriage is one man and one woman uniting together in faithful covenant to one another until death separates them. As we read Genesis, we find very quickly that people diverge from God's design. In the seventh generation from Adam and Eve, we read about Lamech, who has taken two wives for himself, thus breaking that faithful union between one man and one woman. We can only imagine, and probably might be right, that part of the wickedness of man that led to the flood in Genesis 6 included marital unfaithfulness. And then even Abram, the father of all who have faith, took Hagar in Genesis 16:3 as a wife, even at the encouragement of his wife Sarah, which ultimately resulted in marital strife for Abraham and Sarah between the two of them. Later in Genesis, we read about Jacob, who ends up marrying two sisters, Leah and Rachel, through the trickery of his own father-in-law. And then Judah, one of the children of Jacob, ends up having sexual relations with his daughter-in-law, whom he was assuming was a prostitute. This is just the tip of the iceberg of what we find in the story of Scripture. Because of sin, humans diverge from God's design, and not only in marriage, but in all areas of life. But by God's grace, there are some who are sustained in faithfulness in God's designs, and they're blessed for that. We find one of those examples in the marriage of Isaac and Rebekah. Now, in the storyline of Genesis, Isaac really is a supporting character in a secondary role. From his birth in chapter 21 through the end of his storyline when he passes away, there's only one narrative block in which Isaac could be considered the main character. So you look at Genesis 22 and the sacrifice of Isaac. It really is about Abraham and his faithful response to God. Even in Genesis 24, about the marriage of Isaac and Rebekah, it's mainly about the servant of Abraham who is depending on God's steadfast love to provide a wife for Isaac. And then there's the birth of Isaac's twins in chapter 25, Esau and Jacob. But that is more focused on the future generations of God's people and how God is choosing the secondborn over the firstborn. And the blessing in chapter 27 of Jacob and Esau, which Isaac gives, but really that chapter is focused on Jacob tricking his father into getting that blessing. So it's Genesis 26. This is the one chapter where Isaac appears to be the main character, and it's this interaction with Abimelech, one of the Hittites in the land in which he lives. Now, even though Isaac largely plays a supporting role in this redemption story, his marriage with Rebekah outshines both his father's marriage with Sarah and their stumbling around with Hagar as a concubine, and his own son's marriage, or marriages, to the sisters Leah and Rachel, and the conflict that is arising between those two brides. In chapter 24, verse 67, we read that Isaac loved Rebekah. He received Rebekah as God's provision for his need and for the sake of the promise, and he cherished her. Then we read in chapter 25, verse 21, that Isaac prays for Rebekah when she is found to be barren and unable to conceive and have children. In comparison with how Abraham and Sarah addressed Sarah's barrenness, Isaac proves to be a spiritual leader looking to the Lord for help, while Abram is just fumbling around following his wife's suggestion to take a concubine. Rebekah follows Isaac's example by praying to the Lord in the next verse, chapter 25, verse 22, when she feels a struggle in her womb. What does this mean, Lord? Then we read in chapter 26, this chapter that seems to focus on Isaac, in verse 8, that Isaac was laughing with Rebekah. Now, this is in a story where Abimelech thinks Rebekah is Isaac's sister, but this proves that she is his wife. This seemingly insignificant note of laughing with Rebekah actually reveals an intimate delight in a friendship between Isaac and Rebekah, that they have a relationship with one another where they enjoy being together. Isaac delighted in Rebekah, his wife. There's no record of marital infidelity between Isaac and Rebekah. There is no second wives. There's no concubines. None of that. Isaac and Rebekah are then buried together in the cave in the field of Machpelah, which Abraham had bought as a burial place for their family. In one sense, we can say that Isaac's life and marriage was rather unspectacular. Isaac was just loving his wife, delighting in his wife, praying for his wife, and hoping in the promises that God had given him and his family. But isn't that the beauty of God's design? When we follow God's design for our marriages and in all areas of our lives, we begin to find God's blessings. This doesn't necessarily mean that everything will go perfectly in our lives if we follow God's designs perfectly. I think Job would like to have a word about that. But our hope, our strength, our stability in the Lord will abound in joy, no matter what circumstances may arise in our lives. That is the beauty of following God's designs. There is a stability in our hearts and our souls that we're blessed with. Therefore, by God's grace, ultimately it's God's grace, let's seek God's designs for our lives in all areas, which may end up being unspectacular, like Isaac and Rebekah's marriage. Let me highlight a few things in the life of Oak Hills this late week of July. First of all, I remind you again of our missionaries of the month. We are praying for the church plant efforts of New Song, Kansas City, that Pastor John and his soon-to-be wife, Abby, are pursuing and will be leading. We want to be praying for their preparations as they lay the groundwork, do the administrative work of starting a church, begin to invite people to join them in that church planting effort, and begin to fundraise for that church plant. We want to see God's provision and God's blessing on that effort over the next year. And I want to say this note. John is going to be holding an informational meeting at a date yet to be specified, but soon this fall. And it's going to be open to the whole congregation. I would love everyone at church, at Oak Hills, to attend this informational meeting because we're all involved. We're all partners in this church plant. Whether we go or not, we're praying partners. We are committed to seeing God's kingdom work advance through this church plant. So be watching for that. Next week is Joyplosion. We're thrilled to be serving children in our congregation and from the community. We're going to be talking about the fruit of the Spirit and how God blesses us by working that fruit into our lives by the work of the Spirit. That's a work of grace, and it's going to be a blast with our kids. And then I want to highlight coming up later in August, on August 24th, Sunday, August 24th, we're going to be holding a Getting Acquainted with Oak Hills luncheon. We hold this on several times throughout the year, and this is primarily for those who are new to Oak Hills, who want to learn more about the history and the distinctives of Oak Hills. What does it mean to be a member of Oak Hills? This is the first step in that process of becoming a member. So Sunday, August 24th, following the worship service, we're going to have a lunch together and share more information about Oak Hills. We'd love for you to come. If you're interested, it's open to anyone who is interested in attending that luncheon. We ask for our RSVP to Jerry Owens, our administrative assistant. And then the following Sunday, it's Labor Day weekend, but it's August 31st, that Sunday, we're having our end of the summer church picnic Everyone is welcome. We're going to be at West Flanders Park and enjoying afternoon out together. It's a great time to connect, build relationships, meet people. We'd love for you to plan to be a part of that on Sunday, August 31st. Well, thank you for joining me today for our weekly Touchpoint. Look forward to being with you on Sunday for worship. God bless.